Thanks for doing this, Chris. So I don't know how much of an introduction Chris needs. I know that his T-shirt is a brand for a company. He's also he's sort of
I've been traveling since the last shirt I had.
in sort of a Nietzschean sense. He is sort of an Uber kind of person. And so let's start with, we've heard a bit about bots from, you've been thinking about this for quite a while. And, you wrote a post about conversational commerce. Let's go back to that and sort of then come forward to where we are today. So give a sense of where you thought we were going to be and how you thought about it about a year ago.
Yeah, actually, I wrote the first post that I wrote on conversational apps. I wrote a year before the piece that I wrote this January on conversational commerce. The first post was looking at a number of just services that were starting to use SMS, as well as, I don't know if you guys remember Path Talk. Path was that sort of private social network, sort of an oxymoron, but they sort of moved into enabling you to text message brands and companies, which you'd never been able to do before. And so what they did is they sort of had a call center somewhere that would do the calling for you and then send you back a message via text, which was so much more convenient. And so I started to see this move to make brands and companies more accessible in the messaging context. And I was like, this seems like something's going on. And then fast forward a year, and suddenly it just seemed like we were on the cusp of a bunch of things happening. And this is before all the platforms opened up and before there were APIs and SDKs and so on. Uber actually launched Uber launched in Messenger as sort of this interesting way of enhancing a conversation to get a ride. And I saw that and I was like, okay, this is super interesting. As Benedict Evans likes to say, chat and messaging becomes the new runtime, but it's more interesting than that in that apps started to also lose their sort of allure. Gaining app distribution, getting people to download, install, use an app, create an account, all of that friction just started to, I think, become plaque on the behavior in the mobile context. And so messaging, in contrast, is a very clean experience. It's not like an inbox. You sort of bounce from one sort of conversation thread to another, and that just seemed like, from a behavioral perspective, which is what I tend to look at, this incredibly unexplored, untapped, unmined context to deliver services.
So, how do you think that relates to search? Search being sort of the dominant sort of metaphor for discovery on the web, on the desktop. And I often think about sort of when we're building, investing bots at BetaWorks, I think about, sort of it's almost like these are vertical search experiences. There's a search parallel because search does not work in mobile the way it works on the desktop.
Yeah, it's a great point. I spent 3.5 years at Google, of course, and I worked on Google+. Sorry. And it was a super interesting time to be there because it was Google sort of eating itself from the inside out. And a lot of the conversations were about building what is now the assistant that's available in Hello as of today, however you want to pronounce it. And the move and the shift towards voice-based or sort of just text-based or utterances, what was one sort of thing that was going on. The other thing that was going on was that people started to enter longer and longer queries into Google. So it was no longer like this, cars or dogs. In the early days of the web, there was a lot less information out there, and Google was pretty good at sort of getting you the best resources possible. And what also happened to happen around that time period was suddenly we had an explosion of APIs where companies were realizing that it didn't make sense to sort of do pairwise integrations between two enterprises. It made more sense to have a standard API to allow other systems to plug into it. And Google was one of those systems that companies would allow to have access to their internal data. And so suddenly you move from a world which, the web was designed to sort of share information, static information for the most part, to a world, especially in the mobile context, where people are looking to use these devices to access services and to get things done. And so I think the expectations started to change. So whether you're talking about bots as being verticalized search experiences, that almost doesn't go far enough, because what people want are outcomes. They're looking for results. Information is not necessarily sufficient. And so the question is, when you're pulling out this mobile device, what is the context that you're in? How much attention do you have? And how quickly can you get to a solution so the person puts the mobile device away? And I think that's the thing that's really been shifting and the way that we're not yet optimized to think in terms of just getting things done.
Right. So I love that expression. I love the idea of just being able to get shit done really efficiently. it is the sort of it's the uber nerd sort of archetype, right? Because if you know, Esther was up earlier, Clem was up, both of them are building conversational bots that are just fun, right? Chow Ai's 40 million plus people. If you look at the back end feed of Poncho, people are saying I love you every couple of minutes. You know, they're saying thank you. You know, what about the social dynamics of what's happening here? Because when you zoom out, we're talking to computers differently.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny that you sort of phrase it as being about uber nerds. I actually think that it's about humanizing the technology and asking like people to lean less forward towards the computer to sort of make the way that they express themselves more computer acceptable, and having the computers and technology lean towards the person and meeting people where they are. So in a lot of respects, this shift with mobile, I mean, there's many, many more mobile devices than there are laptops, desktops, and so on. That means that you have a whole dearth of new people who are getting online and getting computers, and their first computer is a flat screen device. And that requires you to really think differently about the user experience and about how much people understand these systems that they're using. And so it makes sense, because you don't necessarily know how to, if you're, I think, a normal user, you don't necessarily know how to differentiate between what is a person, what is a bot, what is an automated system. I mean, Google doesn't allow you to follow up and say thank you. There's no tip jar in Google to say, you know, thank you for solving so many problems for me over the years, Google. And yet a bot or a chat application implicitly implies that there's a bi-directional back and forth value exchange that you don't get in conventional software. And so I think before, we've been living in a world of hyper efficiency and, you know, the uber nerd sort of like, you know, sentimentality of just make this as fast as possible, turn everything into a command line, and saying, well, actually, a lot of people, I mean, to your point about people saying thank you or sort of like I love you and whatever, they're oftentimes very bored in their lives. They're looking for sort of ways of connecting. Yeah. And that hasn't been what we've optimized for. And this new shift towards conversational applications and software, I think, allows for more of that expression and more of that sentimentality.
And talk to me, you know, when we think about chatbots in the context of BotCamp and generally BetaWorks, we include voice bots, right? So Alexa and, you know, Google Home shortly. You guys at Uber, you put in an Alexa skill early on.
We're in iOS as well.
I want to hear from you a little bit about sort of, you know, the you know, Apple was clearly there first, right? I mean, Siri was, you know, as somebody said up front, the ads were there, the promise was there. But, you know, you say to Siri, you know, tell me a Donald Trump joke, and Siri says, I found 346,000 results on Google for tell me a Donald Trump joke. You say it to Alexa, Alexa tells you a joke. So how do you think about so we got very different design parameters, but also there's cultural elements to this, because I think that there's good reasons why. I don't understand how it came out of Seattle and Amazon, but I think what Apple did was fairly predictable. How do you think about West Coast technologists, designers thinking about this whole new modality of UI, conversation, human expression, that lean back, where instead of we're teaching humans to talk to computers, we're teaching computers to listen to humans?
That's a very nested question. I think there's a couple ways to sort of look at this. Like, there's this great video from Apple, I think in the 80s. I don't know if it was even before Steve Jobs had come back, but there's like this dictation thing. He's like dressed in a suit, and it's sort of like this weird Mistian world where he opens up this computer that's embedded in his desk, because they didn't think about portable computers back then. And he just sort of like talks about his day and has, I think it's the Navigator, or I don't know, whatever it is. Definitely go check it out, because you can start to see how, if you blur your eyes of all the things that we know about technology today to back then, where things weren't as clear, how they were thinking about the way these things should work from a sort of first principles perspective. Like, what would be sort of a great experience, and then go from there. And it took us 20, 25 years to sort of get here. When it comes to understanding the big tech companies and why they're moving in this direction, I think it's both what I was saying before about these mobile devices are enabling a whole new class of users to come on board that just have a different level of sophistication and willingness to embrace and incorporate technology into their lives. Like a lot of us in this room probably have 2 or more devices that we carry around with us on a regular basis, not to mention those at home and so on. And that's just not the norm. But in terms of thinking about, let's say, Amazon or Google, or even Facebook, moving in these directions, it's like, what is the culture of those companies? And how are they expressing themselves through these new human APIs, if you will, to allow their services, products, whatever, to become more accessible? So the Echo, in a lot of ways, makes more sense, because you can imagine like the case where it's like, how do we remove all friction between the person having a desire for a thing or a product and telling Amazon that they want the thing, and then how do you reduce the amount of time it takes to get you the thing? So whether it's drones or whether it's 1 hour delivery or whatever it is that they're doing, it's like that's the problem that they're solving. And a room computer that can just listen to you when you're like, oh man, I wish I had toilet paper, because you're sitting on the toilet and you ran out. Sorry if that's not an example that's ever happened to you, but you can imagine, you know, hey Alexa, I need toilet paper, and a drone flies in and it's great. Whereas,
or maybe Hey Uber.
Well, if you're actually doing the Uber case, yes, as opposed to, yeah, you should get the toilet paper first. But in the case where, again, like you're like, yeah, I want to go someplace. And I think this is the thing that's going to be super interesting to see how this works out. And when we think about, at Uber, transportation as a service, transportation is like a means to an end. So that's why when I talk about like Uber, it's more of a logistics platform that enables people to move, you know, things or objects or people from point A to point B. You're currently putting in like an address into Uber saying, I want to go to that place, but in fact, in your mind, you're thinking, oh, when I get there, I want to have sushi, or I want to get a drink, or I'm going to the movies. So you actually have sort of a deeper intent that we currently, Uber, doesn't map to sort of a set of things in the world that we could do. But eventually we want to get there, and we want to be the provider, of course, to sort of make that happen. So increasingly, I think companies are trying to find ways of reducing whatever friction exists between you telling those companies what you want and them being able to fulfill those intents and desires.
So how do you stick with Uber for a second? Because I mean, you've been, you know, out there. I mean, you have an awesome app, you have chatbots, you have an Alexa skill, yet they're all highly sort of utilitarian, functional, sort of, you know what the how do you think about the Uber brand if somebody wants to speak to Uber? You know, right now they're going through a very different channel called customer service. You know, how do you bring those things together? How do you, you know, how do you think about conversations with Uber?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And in fact, I don't know if you guys know this. Like, if you ever have requested an Uber through Facebook Messenger and you have a problem, if you talk to the Uber brand through Messenger, we are actually staffing that with live customer support people. And the reason is pretty clear. You know, when you're out in the world, let's say you're looking for your driver and you can't find them, and Uber is your conduit to get to that driver, and you booked your ride through Messenger, you want to be able to talk to someone that can answer that question for you quickly. And if you have to go back to, as we were talking about earlier, an IVR system that goes through like sort of like the tree, and sort of like 12 steps later you're you know, getting in touch with your driver, that's stupid. So instead we're like, how can we make this as efficient as possible? And how do we reduce the amount of stress and anxiety in the world when people are trying to get someplace? So in that case, we're thinking about how we extend the brand to actually be super responsive, super fast, and somewhat magical. And so it's sort of unusual to talk to a brand and suddenly get a person on the other end that's willing to like help you out and work through that. And so we're looking at all the different channels that people use to contact us, and how we can actually enhance those with these platforms as they continue to evolve.
Interesting. So let's pull back and at an industry level. So we are it's September 2016, right? This time last year we had the hype cycle around Slack and Slack bots, and then in the spring of this year we had the hype cycle around F8. I was over this morning at an event on the West Side where David Marcus was speaking, and he spoke for about 10 minutes about Messenger, about services on Messenger, bots on Messenger. He didn't use the word bots once. He talked about Hipmunk, he talked about news services, he talked about customer service, he talked about Rogers Cable, but he avoided the word bots. We've been through, you're here bot camps, you can't run away from it. You know, why 2 hype cycles in 1 year? It's still early days. Why that compression, do you think? And what's going on there? That's interesting. And then, what next?
again, this feels like maybe 3 Medium posts, but like the hype cycle around bots last fall was clearly sort of powered by Slack. And in so many respects, because Silicon Valley is such an echo chamber, and because suddenly all of the sort of press in Silicon Valley was using Slack probably for their internal newsrooms and sharing information that way, they had a visceral experience of what this stuff was, and they could see the value of it. Then they could tell that story. And then as a result of that, and there was a bunch of, Slack became like one of those darlings in Silicon Valley. They were raising money, then they had like their Slack fund. It was sort of like, oh wow, like something's going on here, there's money here. We were about to sort of go off a cliff. Money was like being like sort of pulled back. VCs were like scared shitless. Like suddenly it was like, oh, this is another great gold mine that we should go into. And so I think like Slack gave a narrative that people could relate to, and that was in a very sort of hyper-connected context. And so that got the sort of, conversation going. Very quickly after that, with, whether it was like the integrations in Facebook Messenger or it was the sort of surprising success of the Echo, we started to realize that actually the way that we relate to our devices maybe is incomplete. Maybe there's still another several revs that we need to go through before our technology becomes as natural and easy to use as it should. And so we may have thought that our phones were like the asymptotic sort of place at which technology was going to stop evolving, but actually it turns out like getting rid of the phone and continuing on in a more adaptive like product approach will be useful. There's also been lots of things going on with cars and car OSs. And so in that context, having a screen in front of you at all times is probably not a good idea. I would not recommend it unless you're in the backseat of an Uber. And so talking to that device, this large phone on wheels, so to speak, also gave rise to this opportunity space to deliver interesting stuff there. And so I think that's sort of what the rise has been, and then it became very accessible to a whole host of other people through these platforms. And then furthermore, it became this whole new competitive space where, the number of people who have been launching bot platforms this summer, whether complete or incomplete, like Oracle, has been really interesting to watch, because now everyone sort of wants to be there for the next app store gold rush. And I don't think it's going to turn out that way. I think what we're doing is we're blowing up these apps that previously sat in these little chiclet containers on a flat desktop wallpaper, which came out of the desktop era. All we did was we sort of cut off, 800 pixels or whatever from your desktop. And suddenly it's like the desktop on a smaller screen isn't the whole story and isn't the best way to access this stuff.
Right, so that I think that's a super interesting thread, because that's sort of saying it took us 8 years after the launch of the iPhone to really throw away the desktop metaphors and to start creating something
just
native.
On that point, like if you think about what Steve Jobs said when he launched the iPhone, he's like, look, the problem with current smartphones, which are not that smart because they can't make phone calls and all this other stuff, is that the bottom 40% of the phone is dedicated to a hardware-based keyboard. And so we've spent the last 8 years figuring out what to put in that space. And it turns out that actually the keyboard is the most interesting thing. It's just we weren't able to build into it because there were no APIs. But the keyboard is fundamentally the way in which we compose meaning and share that meaning to the computer. And then a step further is how you take that meaning that's in your mind, transduce it through the keyboard, and then send it to another person so they can understand what you're talking about. And the best application of that now turns out to be like stickers and GIFs. That's the fastest way to communicate between people, it turns out.
So iOS 10 out last week, right? And the discussion we had 10 minutes ago about fun, and about, I was amazed just about how much fun Apple doesn't, is not the top of my list of fun companies. And the iMessage stuff, there's a lot of fun there. Right, so you have, again, it's sort of like how does a company's DNA sort of adapt to this new world, become more conversational. But let's talk about iMessage. I think we're going to see a lot more development around iMessage in the next 6-12 months. One of the companies, Olabot, is doing iMessage work. What do you think about what launched of iMessage? What comes next? And then how does that relate to the app-based messaging products? Obviously Messenger, WeChat, Line, depending which country you're in, pick your flavor.
Again, clearly there's a book here that needs to be written or something. People still read books. But what I'm noticing is that it's significant in some ways that Apple brought out like Nintendo to be like the first presenter on stage. Obviously it dates us if we were, and I was using, we're playing Mario on like an 8-bit Nintendo, so that sort of, puts me in context. But I think what's happening is with better and faster processors, graphics cards, with more expressive tools that allow for more motion to be actually introduced into apps, and moving away from purely professional-based apps that should not be fun and should all be like blue and white or whatever and beige. We are moving into a space where I think a lot of young people are expecting apps to be a lot more fun and a lot more engaging and a lot more dynamic. And so with iMessage, you're moving away from, and it's so interesting to sort of be in this transitional moment where you're using iMessage on the desktop, which now, of course, with Sierra, I think probably has more of the stuff that iMessage and iOS 10 has. But to see how boring iMessage has been for the last several years, to start to have these elements of fun because Apple is going towards a younger audience. Like if Snapchat stickers are kind of like the prototype apps where you're swiping through and kind of embellishing your message, iMessage apps are full runtime that application developers can actually plug into in the context of a conversation, which is an incredibly both intimate and powerful and re-engaging context to deliver your app. It's not a home screen where none of your friends are. So I think that's the shift that's happening, where young people are really starting to push on what we think of as an application. And of course the web and the web platform itself, always like forcing us to always be backwards compatible and to track to the lowest common denominator, has forced us to just make apps that just aren't that engaging or exciting. And so now I think we're seeing a change towards more fun and more play.
So let's talk a little bit about discovery. So, at the outset, Matt and Peter talked about sort of discovery issues. You mentioned Slack and the sort of this time last year, the wave of Slack interest. I think that in Barcamp, we have 5 of the 8 companies are enterprise-like companies, but really focused on Slack. I think that one of the reasons why Slack and enterprise bots are taking hold fast is that the discovery problem gets sort of solved, because if you over there work in my company and you install a Slack bot that's useful and works really well or fun, Giphy Slack bot, then everybody starts using it. So discovery gets sort of solved socially. In iMessage, the social discovery stuff starting to emerge, right? Because you send me a GIF and then I want to reply to that. I think it prompts me to download the Giphy app and do GIF discovery myself. So let's talk about discovery, sort of it's a big question, but how do you think, right now bot discovery kind of sucks. It's happening organically in the enterprise, but it's hard to find great bots.
It's interesting to sort of think about the, risk is not the word, but I guess the surface area for danger for each of these companies. Facebook has to maintain at least the illusion that for the most part when you post or share things on Facebook, it's going to be seen by the people that you intend it to be seen by. And bots being introduced into group contexts actually disrupts that expectation. We don't know how exactly bots or brands inside of group conversations are going to work, nor do we know, I can't think of exactly how, if I were to introduce a bot into a group conversation that I have with a bunch of friends, how I would instruct that bot what our privacy sensitivities are and how to treat the information of each person and each participant in that conversation accordingly. In the context of Slack, what's interesting is that, previously, you didn't want to install a Facebook app because it would post to your wall and then embarrass you, and so the write privilege was the one that was the more dangerous one. But in the context of Slack, because it's inside of an enterprise and it's a closed environment, the ability for a bot to read all the messages is actually the thing that's more risky. And so each of these different platforms has slightly different things to worry about when it comes to opening up like viral discovery. In other words, again, if I can invite a bot into a group conversation that's interesting, everyone in that channel can discover it, just like they can in Telegram. But that may actually erode some privacy expectations that people have, in which case that may imperil the platform's utility and use overall. So how do these platform makers actually address that and do so in a way that's consistent, so that if I learn to use bots in one context, I can take that learning and knowledge and then apply it to another channel? But it's so early days right now, and I think this is why Facebook is going extremely slowly, because they see this as being the next big context in which there's going to be a competition for attention. And so if they fuck it up now, like they did with the newsfeed for a while, I think that's going to actually hamper their ability to get brands on board. And if anything, Facebook knows how to sort of like grow a product to like 1 billion users, get all the brands on, and then sort of hold users hostage to the brands. And so that's probably what will happen again. And so they're being very, very deliberate and careful. Whereas I think in iMessage, what's great is that there's an app store, and everything that's in there has to be approved, and people have a certain level of trust in Apple to evaluate and be able to remove things from the App Store if they violate certain norms. Furthermore, the App Store itself has a reputation built in to some degree with reviews. And so unless or until Facebook has a similar type of review or reputation system, like, oh, 6 of your friends blocked this bot, you might not have enough information to actually make a choice about whether to use it or not.
Okay, I'm going to open up in about 4 minutes to questions. So if you've got questions or think about questions, please queue them up. So I want to talk about the web a little bit. You remember that thing? The web view in Messenger that's just been enabled. I'm seeing that. I can hear a sucking sound pulling the web now into the Messenger. Sort of no context shifting, so sure, it, eases transactions, et cetera, but it's there's shades of AOL here, right? It's backwards.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to sort of, create their own islands of functionality. And as far as like delivering sort of, mini applets, the web is just a great way of sort of like programming them. Dealing with localization issues, dealing with spam and abuse problems and stuff like that. So the web is quickly becoming the web through mostly like JavaScript and Node and like things like that are little tiny little small portlets of your otherwise like web service or API is just becoming sort of like the language with which you deliver that content through little like WebKit views. And the web now in these small little facets is becoming fast enough and nimble enough that it can become like a useful way of sort of writing once and sort of publishing in a lot of different contexts. It also is great as in terms of like a fallback if you are, and a lot of actually, I forget what the stat is, but a lot of people don't even use the Facebook app. They will go to like the web browser. They will go to Safari and they will make Facebook their homepage or whatever. And so they're still using Facebook through the web to access their news feed and then of course to access Messenger. And so if you're in a case where you can't actually install apps for whatever reason, you're still falling back to that, and these bots have to work in that context. So Facebook is one of the few companies that I think has to make their stuff available through the web, and so it just makes sense that if you're a bot builder, you write it through that, and then Facebook will figure out how to render it in all the different contexts in which Facebook appears. It's interesting to see Google move forward with Allo, and as far as I know, there's no web-based version of that, whereas there was with Hangouts. And so Google is trying to solve a different set of problems by moving towards a native runtime. And there is, like, Inbox does exist on the web. I was going to say, like, the Inbox team actually is the one that built Allo. So clearly, they're trying to disrupt themselves as messaging takes over from email. Yeah. And I think that'll be interesting to see in what ways they do actually open up extensions, because clearly they've been doing it with whatever the sort of smart messages are and smart replies in Inbox. But that's a world where these things start to actually sort of, dovetail closer and closer towards each other. And the way that you extend Inbox may be the way in which you extend Allo. Right.
I mean, I got this kind of awesome experience 2 days ago where I was on the web. I clicked on something on Dig, which was an ad for a case for the iPhone 7, Peel case, something.
Peel's great.
Yeah. And I go through the checkout process, and then I get a bot that pings me on Facebook Messenger from Peel confirming the order. And I was like, whoa, how did you get, it's like you could see the...
Well, you realize what just happened there.
Tell me.
You realize the bot just delivered an email to you.
Yes.
It just doesn't look like an email.
Right.
And so this is how it starts to erode. That notification channel that used to go through SMTP and IMAP or whatever, now is coming through the bot channel.
Right.
And so the nice thing about that is that, first of all, there's continuity of identity between these contexts. And so actually the thing that's more interesting there is whether and how Apple Pay, which is now available in Safari, in Sierra, will relate to payments in Messenger on the web, and how that competition of actually who's your payment provider? Well, it is still the credit card networks, but they're being fronted by these messaging platforms. And so if you can say check out with Messenger or check out with Apple Pay, that's getting you closer to sort of moving those conversations, which used to go to email, into the messaging context. And that creates an opening for a long-term relationship where eventually you go to Messenger when iPhone 8, 9, whatever comes out, and you want a great case, and you do a search for, oh man, where's that receipt for that case I bought before? And now you can find, the brand, in this case, Peel, and continue that conversation and say, what have you got for me now?
Right. Favorite bots. 3 favorite bots.
Well, I think actually with what just happened with iMessage and what David Marcus said today, I think bots, I just tweeted this, so I'll just quote myself, is that, the bot concept is useful for us and for people in this room to sort of distinguish between what are conventional apps delivered as binaries that are these full sort of tap once, open a rectangle into a large screen. They're just kind of like apps or brands or companies. So, and they're delivered through a conversational context. So, I mean, Purple is one of my favorites, but it's not a bot. It provides really useful content. It's a great sort of publishing experience. And what Rebecca's doing there, I think, is creating a compelling, very timely way of interacting with content in a way that no news outlet does. It feels very personal and feels very flavorful, as opposed to the New York Times, which gets watered down for a general audience. It's obviously the Uber bot is great, but I have to say that. And ask me in a week once I've played with more iMessage apps, and maybe I'll have another idea.
Questions. Daniel.
A lot of people look to the East, Asian markets, for parallels and precedent for the bot world. I think there are a lot of, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about it, really, and whether that's a valid approach to people that are building platforms and bots that are going to build.
So the question basically is kind of what can we learn from what's going on in Asia, where they've really sort of been, I don't know if I want to say pioneering, these bot platforms, and obviously WeChat is hugely popular there and so on. But the question sort of implies that, well, the patterns that we've seen elsewhere should just apply to this market or to North America or to Europe or to other non-Asian speaking places. And I'm not an expert on WeChat or a lot of the behavior that's going on there, but at a high level, when I think about what happens there versus what happens here, there's a lot of things to remember, which is that, especially in China, the internet is restricted. It's not an open platform like it is here. So when you go to launch something, there's a set of permissions that you need to get before you can even sort of roll your thing out. And so WeChat became the dominant way of actually rolling something out. WeChat is a lot more like the App Store, where you have to get Apple's permission to launch anything than it is like the web. So when we think about the rise of behaviors and the adoption of the web as a publishing platform, that context is different. Furthermore, the way that phone numbers are used, I think, in Asia is very different. And so authentication happens largely through sending users pins to phone numbers. And you're starting to see that more and more here. Twitter sort of went in that direction with digits first, whereas we were all email-based. So that's another sort of interesting contrast where most, I think, North American or sort of non-Eastern users will have some email address for logging in, for authenticating, for recovering passwords. That system is not quite the same over there, and so you have to be sensitive to that. Again, from an identity perspective and payments perspective, you can pay for your utility bills and things like that with WeChat, whereas here, it's taken a lot longer for people to feel comfortable sharing any personal information on the web. There's lots of stories about payment systems getting hacked and all this other stuff, and so there's a lot of fear that I don't know if it's the same in those markets. So you could try to sort of track to what they're doing and sort of think that you're going to get ahead. But I think it's very, very important to watch behaviors here, look at sentimentality, and the way that people think about and relate to their computing apparatus here that might be different than there. So it's not about just doing a one-to-one sort of comparison. It's about actually understanding the marketplace and what the dynamics look like. And furthermore, what the social dynamics look like in terms of publishing and sharing information.
Okay, one more question. Thank you. Did you get it? You haven't got that Obama-like skill. One more question. Question down here.
I think one of the reasons that it's hard to discover bots on Facebook is because it's you to buy ads on Facebook to install.
So the question is it hard to find bots because they want you to basically pay for discovery through ads in Messenger? And I think the answer is it's too soon to tell, as far as I can tell. But absolutely, I mean, long term, yes, Facebook wants you to pay to access that audience. But I also think that they don't know exactly what the best use cases are. And so before going super hard and putting this up in front of users, and you can, when you go to like search in Messenger, it does list kind of like recent things that you can try out. The question is, when does it make sense for Facebook to really push that and put that in front of a lot of users when the bots and apps and brands that exist so far really are doing very basic, trivial things and are not sort of revolutionary? You know, the runtime within Messenger, I think, still needs to get a lot better. Personalization needs to get better. Group behavior needs to get better. I'm really curious what they're going to do with Rooms, which is sort of this thing that I discovered in the source code of the Messenger app, where maybe that's going to be the context that's not Facebook groups, but is a shared context that you can introduce bots into. Whatever that looks like, you know, I think it's going to be interesting, but I don't think they're getting greedy yet. You wait for it.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you.